Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Research America Alliance member webinar. I want to thank everyone in the audience for joining us and for your ongoing partnership. And if your organization is not yet a Research America member, please join us. If we haven't met before, I'm Tim Haynes. I'm the Senior Director of Communications here, and I'm very excited to be moderating this discussion. Today, we are so pleased that we can be joined by author Lee McIntyre. Lee is a research fellow at the Center of Philosophy and History of Science at Boston University, and he's going to speak with us today about science trust, how to effectively engage with science skeptics and science deniers. As usual, I encourage you to type your questions into the Q&A box or into the chat as we go along, and we'll gladly do our best to ask them when we get to the Q&A portion later. With that, let me turn it to you, Lee.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for having me, and hello, everyone. What I wanted to do today was talk to you for about 15 minutes about really the central idea in my new book, which is called How to Talk to a Science Denier. I'm a philosopher. I'm a philosopher of science, and I've thought for a long time about what's special about science. And you might be thinking, what if you want to talk to a science denier, what could be more effective than just presenting the evidence? But as we all know these days, sometimes evidence doesn't convince people. And in fact, sometimes it just enrages them, which raises the question of whether we really know what we're doing. That model, by the way, is called the information deficit model. The idea that, people who are science deniers are just misinformed, and all you need to do is present them with the facts. But as we've seen, just, on CNN every day, facts don't often convince people these days. Now, so suppose you were trying to convince somebody to take the vaccine, that climate change was real, et cetera, et cetera. What would you do? How would you approach them? The first thing that you might think is, I shouldn't approach them at all, because there's something called the backfire effect. And if I get in there and I try to convince somebody that they're wrong, maybe it's going to make things worse. There was a paper in 2010 by Brendan Nye and Jason Riefler, which was about this backfire effect. What they found is that if you took partisans who had false beliefs, and then you presented them with evidence that showed that their beliefs were false, they did not change their mind. Now, that in and of itself is not the backfire effect. The backfire effect was that in a small number of cases with hyper-partisans, not only didn't they change their mind, but they held on to their mistaken beliefs even more strongly after you tried to correct them, which is perverse. I mean, that's terrible, isn't it? Because it means that the disconfirming evidence actually confirms their belief. But here's the good news. That finding was found to be unreproducible. So, by Porter and Wood a few years later, and Nye and Riefler joined them, and it said maybe this was a unicorn. That result didn't hold. So it's still difficult to get people to change their mind based on evidence, but you're not going to make it any worse. Okay, so, and here's some other good news. There was a study in Nature Human Behavior in the summer of 2019 by Cornelia Beche and Philip Schmid, which provided the first empirical evidence to show that you actually could convince science deniers to give up their beliefs. Their technique was not unlike that used by Nye and Riefler, but these people were not partisans. These were just people who were more or less naive to a message of science denial. And what they did in the study is, it was an online study, they would present people with wrong information, and then they would immediately take it back. And what they found was that it didn't always work. That's the power of disinformation. Sometimes when people hear wrong information, especially if that's the first thing that they hear, that's what they're going to tend to believe. But they did find that in a statistically significant number of cases, you could make a dent in it. There were two ways. The first was what you might expect. They call that content rebuttal, which is when, suppose you're an expert in climate science and the topic was climate change. If somebody had heard something that was wrong, and you had the chops and you're a climate scientist, you could present them with information that would maybe overturn it. That, by the way, that is the information deficit model, and it can work in some instances. What I was really fascinated with is that there was a second thing, and it was called technique rebuttal. Technique rebuttal is based on the idea that suppose you're not a scientist, but you want to talk to a science denier. You're not a climatologist. You're not a specialist in evolution or COVID, but you want to talk to somebody about their beliefs. The thing to do is to focus on how they're reasoning. That is not the evidence for their beliefs or what they believe, but why they believe it. And this was based on some earlier research that was done by some cognitive scientists who had found that there were 5 basic steps to science denial reasoning. All science denial reasoning is the same, whether it's about COVID or climate change or flat Earth, it's identical. And here's how it works. They cherry pick evidence. They engage in conspiracy theories. They engage in illogical reasoning. They rely on fake experts and denigrate real experts. And they believe that science has to be perfect. That last one is very telling because you'll often hear a science denier say, well, why doesn't science just prove it? Or, they're not, evidence isn't enough. They want certainty. But of course, that's not how science actually works. And what Bates and Schmid showed is that by understanding how they were reasoning, being able to say, well, that's a conspiracy theory, and here's what's wrong with conspiracy theories, or it seemed to me that you just cherry-picked evidence there, or, illogicality, pointing out inconsistencies in their reasoning, why they required more evidence for the things they didn't want to believe than for the things they didn't want to believe. Those sorts of things could be effective. So this was tremendously good news. I joke with my friends that I could have read this study if my hair were on fire, because this study, really provided the evidence that we all need to know we can get out there. And Bates and Schmid showed that there was no additive effect between content and technique rebuttal. They were both equally effective as well, which means all of us can just get out there. We're not going to do any harm, and we may be able to convince people. Now, of course, as a philosopher, I want to push it. And I wanted to say, okay, this study was done online, but what if you did it in person? Okay. And this study was done with people who maybe were hearing scientific disinformation for the first time. But what if you used it on a hardcore denier? I mean, somebody who really had been marinating in disinformation for a long time. What could you do then? So I went out on the road and I began to talk to people. And I started at a flat Earth convention in Denver, Colorado in November 2018. But over the course of the next year and a half, I spoke with others. And what I discovered is this. Science denial is not about facts and evidence. It's about identity, which means that when you're trying to convince somebody to give up their beliefs, really what you're asking them to do is to give up their community. You're asking them, in a sense, to give up a piece of who they are, which explains why the job is so hard, why you often can't just convince them with facts and evidence. Because think about if you were trying to get somebody to change their religious views or their political views. That's how strongly science deniers can sometimes hold their views. Now, what does that mean? It means that attitude is everything. What I found, and this was based on some research that I did, some reading, though this hasn't really been empirically tested that much, but I read what some other folks had said, and then I went out and tried it myself. Here are the important things: calm, patience, respect, listening. Those are the keys, because science denial, think of it this way: if it were about evidence, then it's about doubt. They call themselves skeptics, but doubt can be overcome with evidence. So it's not just about doubt, it's about distrust. Because if you distrust the person who's giving you the evidence, then what can that person say to you? That's the magic of talking to people in person. If you talk to people in person, they want to like you. They want to trust you if you're calm, if you're a nice person, if you listen, if you're cordial to them. It worked for me at the Flat Earth Convention. Now, I didn't get anybody to tear off their lanyard and say, what a fool I've been, but I got them to listen to me. And I got them to listen to me because I listened to them first. And that's another thing about face-to-face conversation. If you're just, flaming on the comments page in the Washington Post, right? Or, worse, on Twitter, that is not going to work. But when you're face-to-face with somebody, they will eventually say, what do you think? Or don't you think I'm right? And then it's your turn to ask questions. right? So then it's not, then you don't want to be the elite person who knows all the scientific data. You don't want to say, well, if you'd read the latest issue of Nature, you'd know. You don't want to do that. You just want to ask them questions. I'll give you an example. When I was at the Flat Earth Convention, I didn't want to talk about Newton or Galileo because they had read that and neglected it. They had seminars about how all the pictures from NASA were faked. So what was I going to do? Pull out a picture, of the Earth from the moon? No, that wasn't going to work. Instead, I did this. I said, it sounds like your view's based on evidence. And they'd say, oh, yes, we're very scientific. Okay, so tell me this. What evidence, if I had it in my back pocket, could convince you to change your belief? And they really couldn't answer that. And that for me, and I let them sit with the uncomfortability of not being able to answer that, because for most of them, it was a question they hadn't heard before. But it's a crucial question because scientists can always answer that. The hallmark, I wrote an earlier book called The Scientific Attitude, where I argued that the hallmark of science is the ability to change your mind based on new evidence. And that's the thing that science deniers are not able to do. They identify themselves as skeptics, but they really don't understand what skepticism means. They are what I call cafeteria skeptics. They'll fly on a plane to the Flat Earth Convention. They'll tweet about how wrong the globalists are on a cell phone. So they accept certain parts of science, but the part of science that steps on their own personal ideology, that they can't stomach. Okay, and so what they're really doing is identifying these pieces of science that threaten them as a person. So you always have to remember that in your conversation with them. And I guess the last thing that I want to say here is that it may feel good to yell at them, to disrespect them, to just lose your temper. I have got relatives who are anti-vaxxers, but I don't yell at them. I mean, and sometimes here's the thing, if it's your relative, you're more likely to want to yell at them, right? To insult them. Don't do it. All that does is it hurts trust. And the main reason that you want to talk to a science denier face-to-face, whether they're vaccine hesitant or a hardcore denier, you want to build that trust. If you start with somebody who already trusts you, like your friend or relative, you're already ahead of the game. But maintain that trust by being kind, by listening. Sometimes they'll tell you the things. If they can answer that question about what would convince them, run with it, right? Have more than one conversation. Have it be a cordial conversation. I think if there's anything that's going to bring us back from science denial, the crisis that we're in right now, that's going to be it. And I think I've had my 15 minutes, and I think that's a good stopping place. And I'm sure folks have got questions for me. So what have you got?
Oh, yeah. Lee, this has been fascinating. And I know I've got a million questions and wish to be here face to face. But just to start out, I want to invite my colleague Anna to join us on screen. She's going to be keeping an eye on the questions as they come in. So I do encourage, again, everyone listening to write their questions in the chat. But just to start us off, I'd love to just get a little of your thoughts on defining some of those terms. When you say science denier, what exactly do you mean by that? And I asked just because I've seen it used a number of different ways as this has become more visible in media.
Yeah, it's a good question because for one thing, you don't want to use the term science denier in front of a science denier. Okay, so we're among, because it's an insult, right? So I've never met a denier; they're always a skeptic. So we're among friends here. So I'm going to use the term because I think that's actually what they are. But how do I define it? Denial exists on a spectrum. Sometimes there's kind of the audience for denial, the people who are still questioning, they're still gathering information. I define somebody as a denier, not just who is questioning the scientific consensus, because sometimes even scientists do that, okay? That's allowed. I define a denier as somebody who questions the scientific consensus without the evidence to back them up. More than that, somebody who won't say what evidence would convince them, right? Which kind of is a tip-off that their views are not really about evidence in the first place, right? So a denier is not just somebody who questions the consensus, but somebody who is in some sense making themselves immune to evidence convincing them. And that's, and think about it, if a scientist did that, they wouldn't be a scientist anymore.
Right.
That's great. Thanks so much, Lee. And just as a reminder to folks, please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A box or the chat, and we will absolutely do our utmost to ask them. So Lee, one question that has come in, what else does the research tell us about what kinds of conversations we can ask in these what kind of questions we can ask in these face-to-face conversations that you said that you were having?
Yeah. You know, it's hard. I refer you to the Bates and Schmidt study because they actually have scripts in there of some things, and there's an app called Cranky Uncle where you can, by John Cook, that you can put in, and there was even an interactive thing in the New York Times. But here's the thing I'm going to tell you: there are no magic words that you can say. If you go in there with a scripted answer, it's just not going to work. You're going to get shot down, right? You need to have done your research so that you can answer questions as they come, but it's mainly just about it's about your attitude. It's about the approach that you take. That's why it's so important to listen at the beginning, because the person will tell you why they believe what they believe. Now, they may not say, if you could show me X, then I'd give up my belief, but you'll kind of figure out, are they refusing to get the vaccine because they're afraid it'll make them infertile, or because they have other underlying health conditions and they're afraid it might exacerbate that, or because they read some conspiracy theory that it was going to put microchips in their arm and they didn't want Bill Gates tracking them, which is propaganda from the Russian government, by the way. It was appeared in the Oriental Review, pumped out on partisan media. Next thing you know, right? So so you have to kind of figure out where. So that's a very pertinent fact right there. If they brought up that, you could say, well, do you know where that came from? That idea came from. But for the most part, you just want to be able to hear what they have to say, because even though they may not frame it as this is what would convince me, they'll say, and sometimes people will say, this is a matter of faith and nothing you say can convince me. Then you've got a very tough job.
Yeah, I just want to follow up with the next question, looking at some of what's come into the chat. There's a real question in the pandemic, as we have less of these face-to-face conversations.
Yes.
How in the age of Zoom and virtual environments do we really engage and build trust? And I also just want to tack onto that and address something you talked a little bit about earlier, which is just the role of attention and how we focus others in that discussion with this kind of fragmentation of our attention and behavior.
It's so hard. I had trouble even with writing the book because I saved the last chapter for COVID denial. I signed the contract for the book before COVID existed. And then once COVID came in mid-March, I said, well, I'm going to save the last chapter for COVID denial. My editor said, there is no COVID denial. I said, just wait, right? So then COVID denial happened in real time, and it's the last chapter of the book, but I couldn't go out and do research on it. How would you like somebody coming out, even with a mask, saying, how do you feel about COVID? We can't do that. So it's irony, isn't it, that the book is about how to talk to a science denier face to face, and I couldn't do that. What I'm going to tell you is kind of the same thing that the way that I did the research for that is to look at other venues, right? Look at other people's sorts of conversations and participate where you can. Zoom, if that's what we've got, that's what we should use. Phone calls, socially distanced conversation. It's not as if people aren't talking about this. They're not talking about it with no masks, 2 feet away. So it's okay to enter into those conversations as long as you're not trying to come off as a know-it-all or somebody who's telling them what to do. That's very big with people these days. They do not want you to tell them what to do. So, the format within which you follow these recommendations, it's best if it's face-to-face, but if it can't be, still follow them. And again, that's a challenge, because when we're at a distance, sometimes we can feel like, well, I can just flame and nobody can stop me, but you shouldn't.
It's very, very helpful. Thank you, Lee. Another question that has come in, this person says, I'm a social marketer. Our focus is on changing behavior. Changing beliefs and knowledge is a means to an end. How do you integrate overcoming science denial with changing behavior?
That is, I wish I knew the answer to that question, and I bet you do too, because I figured out halfway through my research on climate change, that it was not just about a belief, it was about caring. Some people don't believe in climate change, not because they don't believe in climate change, but because they don't care. I'll be dead by then. I live in a rich community. I've got, the ability to fly above this, but they don't say that because that's not socially acceptable. So what they'll say is, oh, we need more evidence to come in, or, the scientists aren't sure yet. I'll wait for the consensus. I don't know how to get somebody to care. I mean, part of it is to make it personal. There's a funny story about Coral Gables, Florida, which is a very rich community, that the mayor of Coral Gables was a rock-ribbed climate change denier until he became mayor. And then 3 days later, he decided that climate change was real. You want to know what convinced him? His constituents couldn't get their yachts out of the harbor because the mast kept on hitting on the bridge because the water level had risen. So if you can make it personal, that can make people care. Talking to coal miners. The coal miners that I spoke with all believed in climate change. They were older people. They were near retirement age or have already retired. They had grandchildren. That can be important. So find the thing that the person cares about and make it relevant to that.
I think that raises a really good question that's come in the chat as well. Just how do you see differences in how science denial is working across different generations? As we're looking at those different age groups, what strategies work better with certain groups, or what kinds of just themes do we see?
I've never felt that it was a function of age. I mean, you do find demographically that more young people are, attuned to the problem of climate change, for instance. But to me, it's hard because although they all reason in the same way, topically, the motivation behind evolution denial is different than the motivation behind COVID denial, is different than the one behind flat Earth. So it's not really a matter of age. It's a matter, sometimes, again, you make it personal, figure out what it is. Now, if you're a marketer and you're trying to figure out what's the message, what's my demographic, you don't need a slide rule to figure out that most of the pushback from on climate change these days is coming from the right. And same with COVID denial. With evolution denial, it's very heavily evangelical Christian. So, I mean, there are correlations out there that can help you to figure out, who's my target audience here. There's a group at Yale, I always forget what they're called, the Yale Climate Communications Survey, I think it's called something like that. I should know the exact name, but they think about things like this. They think about, how you target different groups. So I refer you to their website. It's Yale Climate Communications, and then I don't know the rest of it, but there's another C in there, I think. So you can take a look at that. They're doing very good work.
Great, thank you, Lee. Another question that has come in the Q&A box. What timescale does it take to change the mind of the average science denier? Is this something that takes weeks, months, years? Can you speak to that a bit?
About 100 years. It's hard. I mean, it depends on the person. The best thing I can tell you here is don't treat any conversation as a one-off. Don't think, well, I'm going to get in there and I'm either going to convince him or die trying, and then walk away and never speak to him again. It's not about how long it takes. It's really about how persistent you are over many conversations. I have read, I've seen research from about people who have used these sorts of techniques to talk people out of cults, out of white supremacy. Now, how do you measure that in, how many years did it take? It's how the attitude that they used and how persistent they were over a focused period of time. That's what really counts. If you want to read something about that, there's a book by Eli Saslow called Rising Out of Hatred. Daryl Davis has a book about how he's talked 200 people out of the Ku Klux Klan. Steve Hassan has a book about, he was a former Moonie, and he talked about how to get people out of cults. So, I mean, there are things that you can read about why love and empathy and respect work. But think about it this way. It takes a little while to build trust, doesn't it? You can't just come up to some, I mean, other than a puppy, nobody's going to trust you the second they meet you. But, it doesn't necessarily take, a long time to do it. You have to approach it in the right way.
Oh, that's really helpful. Yeah, your comments on how this is informed by identity and connection, I think are really powerful. Just in looking at what it means to invite somebody into a new group,
Yes.
in terms of how it helps shape those underlying beliefs. I just want to follow up with another one of the questions that came in chat. This is on looking at ways in which deniers often contradict themselves through inconsistent behavior.
Yeah.
And does respectfully pointing out inconsistencies help, or does it help?
It does, and that's part of technique rebuttal. Because think of it, it's step 3, right? The illogical reasoning. Sometimes I would use this. Here's the best example that's come up recently. Why is it that people will tell you till they're blue in the face that the vaccines have not been around long enough and they don't want to take them because they're scared about the long-term consequences and they're skeptics? And then they'll buy ivermectin, which is a horse dewormer that has, is a miracle drug for what it does, but is not intended, in the dose people are taking it as a human cure for COVID. So why aren't they skeptical about that? So that's a perfectly legitimate question. You could say, I thought you said you were a skeptic. I mean, I get it. You're a skeptic. And to tell you the truth, they don't know the long-term effects of the vaccines. You should still take it because they know the long-term effect of COVID, sometimes death. So take the vaccine. But why are you telling me that you're a skeptic then when you're taking ivermectin? I mean, do you understand that 70% of the calls to poison control in Mississippi last month were over ivermectin poisoning? Now that statistic was true last month. I don't know if it's true this month, but I mean, it's shocking the double standard that people have about their reasoning. And that makes them uncomfortable. And by the way, when you ask a question like that, pause. Don't just fill it in. Let them sit with that for a minute.
That is fascinating, Lee. Thank you. Another question that has come in, this person is asking, as scientists, we use our credentials and experience to give us credibility, but it seems like more and more expertise is frowned upon. How do we balance utilizing our training as an asset versus a liability?
Yeah. Let people get to know you. I can cite you in my book. There are several different examples of people who were skeptical of scientists until they met them. And then they learned these are warm, trustworthy people, kind of smart, kind of fun to talk to. They're patient. I cite one study, one example in the book of during the measles outbreak in Vancouver, Washington, and I think it was in 2014, Governor Jay Inslee sent public health officials down to talk to anti-vaxxers one-on-one. And there are newspaper accounts of them saying, I never realized that scientists were such warm people. This was great. After 2 hours of conversation, I changed my mind. There's a famous case of an American politician, Jim Bridenstine, who was a climate denier. And then Trump appointed him to be head of NASA. After a month at NASA, he changed his mind because he got to know the scientists and he was their boss. And these were warm and trustworthy people. Scientists, I know a lot of scientists, they are great people. But if you go into a room acting like I've got a PhD, back off, nobody's going to listen to you. But if you share your passion and your humility and your uncertainty, the ability to say, look, this is what we know and this is what we don't know. This is what we think we know. The data show us that this is probably true. And here's why we think it's true. And if we saw this, then we'd change our mind. That convinces people because they need to see a little humility. Otherwise, they feel like, well, that person's just a know-it-all. And that rubs them the wrong way. And by the way, scientists are not know-it-alls. Scientists understand error bars and confidence intervals better than anyone. It's just that they often, when they get backed into a corner, they want to say, no, that's been proven. And then that's trouble.
No, this is incredibly helpful. Sadly, we are running out of time, so we've got far more questions than we'll have time to get
Okay.
to. One last one that had come in. What else does the research tell us about the kinds of questions we can ask in these face-to-face or other conversations that'll bring about the most helpful response?
The only thing I can say here, and it's going to sound like I'm shilling for my book, which I kind of a tiny bit am, is that I've got tons and tons of examples of questions in my book, How to Talk to a Science Denier, about all the different topics that I engage people. But the book is not just about my engagement, it's about other people's engagement too, about Ebola, about HIV, about anti-vax before COVID came along. And so, there are all of these things that you can see what worked, what didn't. Again, it is not a script, it's not magic words, it's attitude. That's the most important thing.
No, that's great. Well, I just want to thank you again so much, Lee, for joining us today. This has been such an interesting conversation. Clearly, everyone has been so engaged, and we really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us.
Thanks very much.
Oh yeah, it's been great. I hope we have a chance to do this again. Two quick announcements before everyone goes. Links are being added to the chat, but next week on Wednesday, October 13th at 2 p.m., we'll have an off-the-record conversation with Jane Bigham, who's the Senior Health Policy Advisor for the Senate Health Committee. She's going to speak with us about Chairwoman Patty Murray's vision for pandemic preparedness legislation. I also would like to remind everyone that applications are open for our Civic Engagement Microgrant program. So please share that out far and wide with your networks, with any early career researchers you may know who are interested in projects centered on science communication, on policy, and on building partnerships with public officials and the community. Those applications are due on Tuesday, October 19th. Visit the website on the screen for more information or to apply. And with that, have a great rest of the day, and we will look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you so much.